How is everyone? Tired? I can appreciate that. And I can also appreciate that comment about being depressed. I thought Emile did a fantastic job of highlighting it's hard to hear all this news and information, and I congratulate you all for coming to learn about it and seeing and trying to understand more about how our planet works and how it's changing. My job here at the end is to share some optimism for where and what we can do in the future, and to share some stories, more than graphs, a lot of times knowing about people, place, knowing about species that are impacted, help us to understand just how complex all of this is and where and how we can make a difference in making some changes. I'm a woman. I'm an environmental scientist, and I study climate change impacts on our planet. 2017's been a really interesting year. 3 marches, one after another in the early part of the year. And this global program that I did happened before that. People know and are active in trying to figure out where and how we can plan for solutions on our planet, where and how we can be more united, where and how we can find common ground, common purpose, and we can start to move forward with some really progressive actions. These actions and these visions are already in place prior to this crazy year we've been having, that's part of what I want to share with you today. One of the things that I learned to do as part of the year is to not be shy on social media. There's more and more science available on social media, and I welcome everyone to join me. This is my social media handle. That's for Facebook and for Twitter and Instagram, and it's possible to follow along as I and people who I work with do field science and are trying to tell the stories of our changing planet. And then I share news reports and information as it comes up. So much is changing so fast. It's actually becoming really hard to teach. I don't know if other faculty that are here right now would agree, but you just can't keep current with everything you would want to include in your class. But the beauty of where and how teaching should be set up is that the students are finding those resources for us. So icy lands in a warming world, I go places that others don't go. I go to the cold parts of the earth, the poles and the mountaintops, and I try to understand how cold places change as a result of a warming planet. I also go hot places. I was on sabbatical this past year and I went to Australia. In Kevin's talk, he alluded to just how hot Australia was. And indeed, from a personal perspective, I was based in Sydney. Sydney is down here. It was far hotter than I was expecting, and then somebody who normally goes to Arctic and alpine places is comfortable going. This is one map showing where and how it can be hot. Other maps come out, cartoons. We were in the lightly seared part of Australia, but I personally felt like I was in the carbonized part of Australia because I much prefer the cold. People come up with different ways to explain where and how climate is changing. We have to listen to all the different ways that people are explaining, including that this ends up being one of the ways that people are putting out there, is that it's really not us and it's out of our control, and all of these stories are coming at us at once. As part of what I did in Antarctica, we were given resources and tools to think about how we craft our own message. Each of us as female scientists, 76 of us on a ship in Antarctica together, how do we craft our own message that tells the story of the science we do in this world? And so what you're going to hear today is the way that I've crafted it, because it feels authentic, and it helps me to share more personal tales about a changing planet. So one of the things that I've recognized is that each of us will be affected by the changes, some more than others. As someone who lives in a wealthy country with decent family income and some flexibility in what I could do, I don't think I'm going to be as affected as many other people on this planet already are and will be in the future. So climate change is a story of caring about the concerns of others, not just of ourselves. And when we look at where and how personal values fit in, we have to recognize that's something we often share. Many of us share the common value that we care about others greatly. Risks due to climate change are imminent and distant. Some are already happening. You've heard about some of them. Some of them are ones that will happen in the future. You've heard about a lot today, but are there ones, this is the active learning part. There's 2 questions that you all get to answer as part of what I do. Are there some changes due to climate change, risks, that you've heard about that haven't been mentioned yet? Can we add in more?
Basically, the world's poor are the most affected by the negative.
The world's poor may be most affected by the shifting climate.
Oxide, but there are other gases like methane.
So there's multiple aspects of a changing planet, including the gases in our atmosphere and the feedbacks that are a result of change moving in one direction and reinforcing itself that can change the planet in more rapid ways. So when there's, this is a fantastic one to bring up, when there's unequal change affecting people in the world and some people don't have food and water, they're unlikely to be happy in that situation. And we will be impacted by some of those changes that happen as a result of war, and certainly those peoples will be greatly impacted. And there are wars that are going on that have many causes, but climate change is considered to be one of the underlying causes. Thank you for highlighting that. The back of the room? Shifting seasonality is, so hurricanes and strengthening hurricanes, shifting seasonality. A big part of the research I do is on where and how our seasons are going to shift. And that includes what you all, we can't directly attribute what happened here in Durango this past spring to climate change, but this past spring, it was warm in March, the fruit orchards all bloomed, the flowers were all out, and then there was a really cold period in April, and we lost a lot of flowers. There was another cold period in June, and our plants didn't recover. The best stories to hear are, I went to a soccer tournament in Grand Junction, and met someone who's running one of those local orchards and heard that he had 1 apple on all his trees as an entire orchard, and he just bought the orchard. So, you know, where and how does climate change throw us some curveballs, climate variability, and the challenges of an altered seasonality? Let's take one more. Thank you. That's a really important one to bring up and highlight too. I definitely will. So she said the spread of disease. So as climate shifts, there's the possibility that regions of our planet that have been cold enough to not have the animals that carry the disease, that transmit the disease to humans, couldn't live, or couldn't live for as long a year during the year. So similar to, we talk about bark beetles getting worse because of climate change, mosquitoes can increase in abundance, they can shift their range, and with those shifts in the ranges of mosquito can go the shifts in diseases that they carry, such as Zika. And I'm just giving you one example with mosquitoes and disease. So we could go on all day about different impacts. What I wanted to help you all recognize is that we can't cover everything. You all already know a lot. And so where and how do we bring all that information together? Ooh, let's go back. The risks due to climate change vary across space and among species. That was highlighted in Emile's talk. That's really important. That's part of why we have to care about the concerns of others, because we may not be in the zone where those changes are directly happening. I went to Antarctica and I met a lot of penguins. Here's a hill slope with just one. Penguins live in places I didn't think they lived, including, for a mountain ecologist, this was really cool, on the tops of mountains and hill slopes in Antarctica. And one of the people on the trip was the penguin lady. Her name's Diane DiNapoli. She lives in Boston and she tells stories about penguins. And a big theme on penguin biology right now is where and how they're going to be impacted by climate change. And she helped me understand that penguins are an indicator species. Many of the species in the world, in the populations, are endangered and becoming more endangered, but not all. And that there's complex ways that penguins are affected by climate change, including that this is the one that impacted my class the most when she spoke to my class last week. And we did that through Skype. Media is amazing. Internet is amazing for being able to connect around the world. That my students reacted, and you could just see the looks on their faces when they saw a picture of a penguin buried in snow. So the dynamics of what Kevin talked about, where a warmer world can be a snowier world, means that a bird that has a strong affinity to sit on its egg no matter what happens around it may allow itself to get buried completely by snow and suffocate as a result of the snow. And so there are these really powerful images that are coming out. Despite all of these, we know our actions aren't sustainable. One of the approaches being taken right now in climate science communication is to put out some of the worst case scenario stories, ones that I've never seen covered as much in the media until this past year. There was an article in the New York Post that spun the climate change science communication world a lot because it was incredibly bleak. It was the 1% chance of the worst things happening by the end of the century. And a lot of people debated whether or not that was strategic, whether it was what we should be doing for climate science communication. I'm not yet convinced that the Earth won't be habitable because the diversity of life on our planet is really pretty incredible. And so we're talking about where and what harm, the conflict, the strife, the concern for where and who doesn't do well and which species don't do well that happens in the interim. We can have a lot of information, all this incredible information shared by Ryan and Gary and Emily and Kevin today. And we can still look at a really dirty car. This is my car. And I wrote on it, not dirty yet. Clearly it was already a pretty dirty car. This is my field vehicle that I drive around in Crestview with. And well, I just thought it was gonna get a lot dirtier that summer. And so it wasn't really a dirty car yet. So we can look at evidence and come up with a different conclusion than what the evidence suggests, including scientists. And then this happened to my car this same early season spring. And when this happened, we added "and not stuck yet" to the back of the car. But yeah, we did get stuck in a snowbank, and field research assistants and I dug for about 30-40 minutes to get the car out. But in the end, it wasn't our digging that got the car out. It was a kind person who came with his pickup truck trying to drive down the same road that we were on, who was willing to turn his car around and give us a tow line and pull us out of the ditch. So where and how can we help each other as we try to manage for all of the complexity? So why does that happen? This is something that's really important to think about. I'm not sure if you can read the text. It's a comic. It's part of a whole series, multi-panel comic series that tries to explain this thing called the Backfire Effect. That some information, when we hear it, we quickly accept and we readily accept. That some information, when we hear it, we're just like, no, give me more evidence. I'm not ready to believe that yet. And then we hear more evidence and we hear more evidence. And despite hearing more evidence, as we hear more evidence, why would providing more evidence make someone less likely to believe an idea? That is one of the challenges we have right now in climate science, but in a fair number of different issues in our world, is maybe we need a different approach to sharing information, and a recognition that just adding more information isn't necessarily helping. The end part of this comic tries to put forward a solution, and they say that the solution is to know that this is part of our psychology, and if we know that this is part of our psychology and the psychology of others, then we can be conscious about it and be aware when it's happening, because for you all it may not be climate change, but there may be some other issue that's one of these ones for you that it's hard to accept. I want to offer a different solution to this, which is that I think we need to foster a kinder world, one in which we consider the impacts to others as if they were happening to ourselves. I want to change the frame, change the way we talk about this to one of caring and values rather than having it all focus on the evidence. So you all came at 1 o'clock. Many of you came at 1, some of you came a little bit later, and you've been here for a while. What concerns brought you to a climate change symposium at Fort Lewis College on a Thursday afternoon in early November? I want to hear a few concerns. Yeah? Thank you for sharing that. It's an important one. Other ones?
Tired of seeing species.
The loss of biodiversity on our planet is a concern for many. Other concerns that brought you here today?
I wanted to hear if NCAR was going to be muzzled.
We're doing our best to not be muzzled as scientists, and to be honest, that's one of the interesting parts. If you stop giving scientists money for research, then they have free time available to start talking more. It's part of a reinforcing cycle. Yeah, maybe it would be a good thing if we don't want to be muzzled, but it's okay if they cut our money.
I'm concerned that we are not addressing the problem from a political point of view.
Where and how do we start to manage for this issue? I hope some of what I share will help with that as I share some of the end part. I don't have expertise in politics. That's actually one of those things that most scientists are discouraged to do. And it's starting to get to a place where you start to feel like, I don't want to run for office. I know I don't want to run for office, but I want to help other smart people run for office, and I want to empower them with the information and ideas. And I already said to one person who was here tonight, there are a few politicians. I've said it to 2 now politicians that are here tonight. I'm like, tell me how I can help you. So that's part of us volunteering ourselves. How to be part of the conversation. Anyone and everyone gets to be part of the conversation, and figuring out where and how we approach it, figuring out how and what our voice is, and then feeling supported and sharing our voice is really important. So that's incredible. And I would love to hear stories during the social of people who feel like they found their voice as part of coming here. I'll take one more.
Yeah, this is more of a statement. I'm a geologist that worked for a major oil company, and in the 80s they had an independent consultant do a study about the high prices of gas and why people, the gas, all this complexity about drilling and transportation and all that, and explaining this to people, and yet a gallon of milk costs the same amount or more. And they after analyzing and talking to a lot of people, facts don't matter. By telling people that this is the price of gas, it became an emotional issue. Telling me I can't go on vacation, I want to visit my grandmother once a week, I can no longer afford it, so it's once a month. And you could talk to the people about why gas is expensive. Irrelevant. It was emotional, it was preventing them to do what they wanted.
Yeah, incredible point to make. Emotions are really important. And as a scientist, maybe this is going to change, but for my career, which started in the early 1990s, I've been discouraged to share my emotions as part of sharing science. And the new phrase that I've started to talk about, and I used when I did this program in Antarctica on the ship, I said that as scientists, we need to unpark our hearts. We're human, we have hearts. We need to take them out of the parked mode and move them into drive and figure out where and how, what's appropriate, because in no way do I want to suggest that science then becomes subjective. It's different, but it should be possible for me to say and tell you when I'm frustrated, I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm happy, and exasperated and any other anxious tends to be an emotion that I feel a lot lately. And we need to be able to talk about those emotions as part of sharing science, including for scientists to be able to do that. So a couple quick slides on what I do. I study climate change effects on the mountains and the poles. Dust deposition Doesn't seem climate change related, but it could be. Changing climate in the Colorado Plateau could lead to and accelerate how much dust comes into our mountains. I got brought into a study back in 2007 to understand if that mattered for mountain plants. And one of the key tales I want to tell on this is that when a scientist plans for a study to understand what the dust deposition impacts are on mountain plants, we end up with results different than what we expect, and that's science. I don't have a plan or agenda when I put together, I'm doing a study, I'm collecting the data, and then I'm trying to see what the study says and shows. And in this case, we found that mountain plants could be more sensitive to climate warming in mountain landscapes when snow melts early. I do these studies in the Arctic. I go to Alaska and to Greenland. We've melted snow early in Alaska, and we found what we expected there, which is that fall starts early. When fall starts earlier, there may be less carbon being brought down and into the ecosystem and out of the atmosphere. But it didn't happen for the reason we expected. And so it was another place where we found a surprise. In permafrost-laden soils that are melting more as it's warmer, we didn't expect the plants to run out of water. And yet that's what the data and the analysis showed. I continue to do these studies. Here in Colorado, we have the start of a 10-year effort to understand how mountain watersheds work, including when climate change and climate variability from year to year gives the system a push. How far does that system go when you give it a little bit of a push? We're trying to understand how mountain watersheds work and supply the water and the quantity and the quality of the water on which we depend. And Emile highlighted how important that is for agriculture. It's important for people and human well-being. It's important for energy systems. It's important for recreation, where and how those water supplies are provided. So as scientists, the emphasis has often been on where and how we plan for publications and grants. But what if scientists want to do more? I've met so many who do. Oftentimes, we're doing and investing in science because we want to help provide for the well-being of others. And somewhere in the mix of what we do and what gets valued, it can sometimes get a little bit lost. Learning and putting scientists into positions of leadership and helping us have the skills that are needed to be in those positions of leadership is a really important part of new and growing programs, including the program that I participated in. This is the program I participated in. My involvement was generously supported in part by Fort Lewis College, by some of you all here tonight, through foundation money. And I got to go on a ship to Antarctica with 76 women in science from around the world, and I'm now part of the leadership team for this program. Our goal and our vision is to train 1,000 women in science to lead and affect change in policy and decision making over the next 10 years. I was here in Portal Point, Antarctica. This is one of the gateways onto the continent. But more important than being here was that I was present with some absolutely incredible people, and it just changes things when you're connecting to people rather than just going to amazing places. And most of the time as a scientist going to the poles, I'm in a camp with 2 other people. So it was actually one of my fear points going into this program was that I was going to be overwhelmed because I also am rarely in an environment with this many women at once. Mountain and polar science isn't a female-dominated profession, in case you were wondering. So yeah, it was pretty different. I met women from around the world, and I grew to feel that their home could be my home. Kevin talked about El Nino, and where and how El Nino and these El Nino-La Nina cycles mean that the resources one half the Pacific Ocean gets, the other half doesn't get until the cycle switches. It's important to have some friends in Fiji, Australia, Japan, and China, so you can have those cross-ocean discussions about an understanding of the fires that happen in Australia and being present when you hear about the droughts that are happening there, because it's when we're getting an overabundance of water. And that complexity of the Earth is best understood by having these discussions with people from other places. And as I mentioned, we were the first of 1,000. I want to quickly get to some solutions. So I'm going to, oh, here we are. Here's the first one. It's in big bold letters. I am giving you my version of solutions. There's geoengineering solutions. That's where and how can we control, through an engineering framework, the climate of our planet. Paul Hawkins has written an incredible book, Climate, How Can We Reverse Drawdown, How Can We Reverse the Effects of Climate Warming. Mine kind of mix into those, but they're also inspired by my heart and who I am in the world, and so I wanted to share mine rather than sharing others, and then let you know about those resources. I think sometimes we overuse our resources and we blow through a lot of carbon, fossil fuels and carbon, because we're sad and we're lonely, and if more of us recognize that and invested in activities to connect us so we have a greater sense of belonging and being kind, it's easier to do things that are fossil fuel light, and invest in just sharing in community with one another. We can act individually and collectively. There's lots that we can do ourselves. Emily mentioned a lot of those, where and how we use our dollars to vote, where and how we vote, but also collective action is needed at this point, and where and how can we take part in that. We can conserve. What I tell my students is that for species to survive, they have to be able to tolerate a changing climate, adapt and shift their genes, or move somewhere new, and conserving more land and oceans creates the space in which the species have and need to be able to move, and it's also where and how we pull carbon out of the atmosphere, and we better protect soil, keeping it where it needs to be. We can experience our world. These are my kids. My kids are over there. I went to a great talk on Tuesday night that said, where and how do we share this with our children and our grandchildren? We bring them to events like this, and we start to help them understand and tell the stories themselves too, and they're part of the many voices that are needed to share climate change science. And we connect with people and we build community. We need to have lots of scientist friends. That is one of the things that makes me the happiest, when one of my friends tells me I'm their scientist friend, because I know that that means they'll ask me any question. There's just the openness to have an exchange of ideas, which needs to happen more. And what I want you all to leave and part with tonight is a feeling that you have a bunch of new scientist friends. All the folks that have given talks, myself, and anything we can do to help you connect with more of the incredible scientists, social scientists and natural scientists at Fort Lewis College, that will help have interesting discussions at soccer games, at Halloween trick-or-treating, or wherever you happen to run into us. We're happy to answer questions at other times in addition to the panel. So with that, I'll say thank you. Share your hearts and your minds, and we'll move on to the panel.
And indeed, we're going to do that. Somebody, you may have a question or so for Heidi, but once she's on the panel, that'll be your opportunity. So we're going to try to crank this up as quickly as the people can get up there. They have to find their signs and put them in front of themselves. Dick White, who some of you may or may not know, the mayor of Durango, is going to moderate this panel. And Dick has a PhD in astronomy from Columbia University. He was professor of astronomy at Smith College for quite a while before he came to Durango. And I could say more about Dick. He's very involved in sustainability. He's very, gives lots of climate talks around the area. But anyway, Dick, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to let you control these folks.
I want to say it's a privilege to be up here with a distinguished panel, and particularly to be addressing climate change with a large audience of people in Durango. It's a deeply challenging issue, one that has driven me for a long time. It drove me out of academia, actually, because teaching one course on climate change every 3 years was not meeting my need. I found a wonderful home in Durango, many friends. So let's get on with this tonight. I will give a preface. We want to make it possible to have as many questions as possible addressed by a panel, which means two things. One, keep your questions concise. We don't want long statements. We want questions that the panelists can answer. Conversely, the last panel I had the privilege to moderate, and some of you were in the room, not all of the panelists were equally concise. So I'm going to ask both the audience and the panelists to be concise about their questions and answers, so that we can, within an hour or so, have further inform all of us. The suggestion I was received was to first ask if the panelists have questions for one another, and maybe one apiece at most. No obligation to raise a question, because the sooner we do that, the sooner we get to audience questions. Okay, I think I'm getting a majority. I'm very sensitive to majorities. 3 votes out of 5 gets things done in the city of Durango. So I will take questions. Can we raise the lights a little bit so we can all see? Yeah, I will definitely try to do that. Since the microphone is in the hands of Routledge, he can have the first shot.
Hi, thank you very much. Excellent presentations. Thank you guys so much. But nobody brought up the issue of tipping points, and especially runaway points of no return. And our current peaking is often compared to the period about 55 million years ago, where if you look at a geographic spike, you see this huge spike in temperature. It goes up, comes back down. But the climb years was 10,000 years, and it took 200,000 years to come back down, and it's not in a matter of centuries. So when people say we're heading maybe to 4 degrees, we're not heading to 4 degrees as if it's going to level off. We're in a runaway climate that is, we're going to shoot past that and end up with an iceless planet. And Heidi, I don't think that's survivable in a human sense. So Gary, maybe you can address that, given that you're the geologist here.
And if while the speaker is responding, if we can get the mic around to somebody else with a raised hand.
I'm going to let Kevin address that one.
Okay.
Let me make a few comments, because this really relates to irreversibility in many respects. And under the Paris Agreement, there were 2 targets that were talked about, trying to limit the global mean surface temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2.0 degrees Celsius. Well, we're already around 1 degree Celsius. I don't think 1.5 degrees Celsius is viable. There is a draft report from the IPCC which actually deals with this, and they talk about, as I understand it, that indeed it's impossible, or basically impossible, to limit the global mean surface temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius, but maybe we can get back to it. And so you have some kind of a trajectory where the global mean surface temperature goes up to 3 degrees Celsius and then comes back to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Well, if you go up to 3 degrees Celsius, you're going to melt a whole lot of ice in Greenland, which is not going to come back no matter what you do, I'll tell you that. that's one of the tipping points, one of the irreversibilities. And the same thing happens with things like the Gulf Stream and many other things. There are a lot of irreversible things, and I find it quite unacceptable to talk about coming back to 1.5 degrees. We don't, we will have a very different climate than if we don't go past 1.5 degrees in the first place. I mean, myself, I think that 1.5 degrees should not have been a part of the IPCC. It came out of the Paris Agreement because I don't think it's practicable. It's going to be tough, but it may be doable to hold us down to 2 degrees Celsius in terms of the overall warming. But we're on the wrong trajectory right now.
I feel like that question was also directed a little bit at some of what I said. So I don't think we'll know until we're past a tipping point. That's often the case for a complex planet, a lot that we can know and understand. So my hope is that we make good choices, that we're not there yet, and that we make good choices so that we don't get there. Because, I mean, just what we see with when we change land from a natural system to a managed system of some sort, it's really difficult to get back to that natural system. We with all the incredible science we know how to do, we can't put ecosystems back to what they were before. And for habitable, I used the word habitable, but I didn't say for who and by what species. So it's yeah, there's the potential that a lot of people don't do well, and that I don't know, maybe there's the potential. I mean, there's definitely stories out there that say there's the potential that it won't be a habitable planet for people. But there will be life on our planet, and we want to be part of the life on our planet. And so hopefully that motivates us to do some of the changes we need to do.
The question this is really on.
Yes.
The question that I want to ask actually is probably worth an entire symposium. And I just want to say, I appreciate the science, the information you all have done. As a biological scientist, I especially appreciate and resonate with Heidi's assertion that we also have to get heart back in this. And I know I was trained, you write in the passive voice and you don't put any feeling or anything else into your science. We have to change that. Ethics. What is the ethics? How do we talk about the ethics of the consequences, the impact of climate change? And are those of you, you sitting up here on this panel, in the spotlight, people who people believe in, are you willing to also tackle or tack on the ethics side of climate change and global warming?
Absolutely.
May I ask about while the panelists are responding, other folks will raise their hands. I think Richard's going to be the mic person. Thank you. Go ahead.
Personally, absolutely, and yes, many more in science should join on board. I was invited to be part of a panel. I was in New York City over the weekend and at the French Embassy on a panel to discuss an egalitarian future. And one of the statements I made is we need a just world, we need an equal world, and we won't have a sustainable world until we also plan for those other two. And so in that regard, we need to start having those shared discussions. It was one of the most fun discussions I've ever been part of. Feminist activist from France, architect from Princeton, myself, and the executive director of Planned Parenthood. Those are the kind of groups we need to start getting together. And then we need to be doing that at the local level in rural communities as well as in big cities and at the global level.
Just I now have my department chair hat on. I think this is a gratuitous pitch for Fort Lewis College. And here's what we've done in our department. I think we can all attest that scientists and engineers have helped to make the world a better place. On the other side of that coin is we are the source of much of the damage on this planet. Innovation, all of the things that we love come at a cost to our planet. And so as part of our career, I think education is where you start the ethics side of things. I think it's irresponsible to graduate scientists and engineers, put them out into the brave new world and not expect them to think about the ethics of the job they're doing and what they are doing. So as a small part of that effort, we have required for our engineering students in both computer engineering and our general engineering degree that they take a professional ethics course. And so I think, again, where this gets to a Fort Lewis specific thing, we're the only engineering program in the state of Colorado that requires our students to take the entire liberal arts curriculum to include an ethics course, which is above and beyond our general ed requirements. So I think in a broad scope, we have to expect more from our education system. When you write an NSF grant now, you have to talk about ethical behavior and scientists with all your postdoctoral students. So there's a recognized need for that. We have very poor examples in this country of ethical actions, whether it's in science or whatever. And I think it's a climate that we need to fix, and it has to start sooner than college, I would argue. But we're trying.
But on the, I mean, you've just spoken a lot about ethics, and there are certain norms that are in place that scientists in particular are expected to hold, and so that's one aspect of ethical behaviors, to uphold those norms. But the other part that I want to introduce here is much more related to what I don't know whether it comes under ethics, but I would call it much more values and values oriented. And I think I disagree a little bit with Heidi. This might invoke some discussion, but I think you have to be very careful how you deal with that. And I'm quite happy to talk about my value system, but I think you also have to recognize that other people have different value systems, and find ways to communicate and to recognize that there are different views. And I suppose one of the most basic kinds of that comes in here are things relating to different religions, for instance, and people have different religions, and we're not trying to convert everyone to the same one. So I'm very happy to talk about value systems, but I think they need to be declared and separate, or try to separate them as much as possible from the discussion about the facts and the science and the evidence.
I think I believe the preface for that question said, yes, it could be a whole nother symposium.
Okay, so I actually wanted to
go ahead,
address that.
go ahead, Emily.
So from my own personal experience working with farmers and ranchers and foresters, this is personal, right? I work across a 6-state region, but this affects people personally. It affects their incomes, it affects their livelihood. It's part of their value system and part of how people live in the world. And so I think the more we recognize that this is a personal issue that affects all of us, we all we're all connected in a lot of ways. The more we might get towards your question. And again, it's a big one. Thank you.
Before I go on, Gary, do you have a response?
I think we're all here on this panel today because we think this is a really important issue. So I think my colleagues have brought up good points, and I'll just leave it at that. We're here. This is part of our telling you that we think this is important, and this is part of our ethical response to share our information.
Susan Atkinson, it is worth mentioning to all in the room that she is one of the leaders of the Citizens Climate Lobby here.
Great, thank you. This question is for all of you, and even Dick as well, if you'd like to chime in. I appreciate the science hat and the background that you come from, but if you were able to take off your science hat, and if you were given a national platform that you're now going to be able to speak to the nation about climate change, and you had 1 or 2 sentences that you wanted to convey, and convey it as a human being, given what you know, the science that you know, what would you say?
Who wants to lead off there? If nothing else, I'll give you a chance to think. And something that's been running through my mind for much of the last hour is my own motivation for actually leaving academe and getting engaged in the climate issue is, and I think Emile's talk makes this very, very clear. We're talking about impact on billions of human beings, actually all of us, but as we learn, some more than others. And I discovered at a sustainability conference 10 or 12 years ago that my personal motivation is driven by compassion. And I think that's, if we all come from that space and saying, wow, how do we act on this?
So I can have a go. I mean, climate change is a serious problem. It's a global problem. We're all together on spaceship Earth. The US is a part of that. We cannot separate that. We should tell that to Donald Trump. We should put a price on carbon, and there's major changes that are needed in our economy with regard to the subsidies that are going to fossil fuels, and work for a more sustainable environment. And the attacks that are being made by the current administration in getting rid of the Clean Power Plan, which was an amazing effort under the EPA, where there were over 6 million comments that were made by the public in developing that plan. And I thought the EPA did an incredible job in developing it to be very flexible and run by states and so on. And it's being wiped out by Pruitt and the current administration without anything to replace it, and it's unconscionable.
It's a big question. I would say that the time to act is now. We need to do something now. We generally respond to things that we have to pay for, and so economics is important. And again, we're all interconnected, and we have a responsibility to ourselves and to each other to try to do something about this.
So I'm going to go with the lowbrow bumper sticker approach. You know, if you could put a bumper sticker on every car, what would you want it to say that would leave the right message? And I might say this: get smarter, consume less.
Okay, it's kind of a funny one. Anyway, I think that I agree with all of my colleagues. We have to work together to keep this planet a healthy place for us and for future generations. And not addressing this is the height of irresponsibility and selfishness.
So I feel like I put mine as part of my talk in some ways. And to add to that, One of the things I haven't heard any of us say that I think is a really important part of that climate change communication is these are, it actually was in the final graph, the cartoon in Kevin's talk. There are so many things we should and want to do anyway, and the co-benefit is that we manage climate change on our planet, but we also manage pollution, we manage health, we manage so many other factors at the same time. Most of the key ways that we change and manage for climate change benefit more people on our planet, and we should all want that.
Next question.
Oh, if I may, the reason I'm holding the mic is I have something to say also. I'm Richard Grossman. I've been very impressed by the head power, the brain power here in this room, especially from Fort Lewis College, and also the heart power. As a gynecologist, though, I'd like to move down a little bit further in the anatomy and talk about what has already been spoken about, and that is misconceptions. 45% of the pregnancies conceived in this country at this time are not planned. And if you'll look at one of these, there are piles of them both inside and outside the room in the back. The biggest thing, the biggest carbon cloud is from the birth of a child.
This question is for Emily, but anyone else can chime in. It seems to me that two of the most powerful impacts that we could have in agriculture is eating local and not eating meat on a worldwide scale. Could you talk about whether that would be impactful?
Well, certainly eating local would, of course, reduce the transportation costs and the greenhouse gas associated with the way that we move our food around our globe. So that is true. Also, eating meat, of course, has a big carbon footprint. So both of those things certainly could be part of the solution.
I have to speak up on behalf of, since I come from New Zealand. New Zealand exports a lot of primary produce. I mean, of course, it's out of phase in terms of seasons, but New Zealand can actually produce a lot of stuff and get it into the American market, probably with a smaller carbon footprint than some of what happens here. And so one has to be very careful about these kind of statements, that just eating local is a sufficient statement. And I just want to put a little caution on that and put a plug in for New Zealand produce.
And another part of that is that it's not always possible to eat local, right? Or sustainable. We can't survive most of us, out of our home garden, you know, for most of the year. So that's not always a viable option.
I'm not sure if everyone heard that, but the questioner expanded that to a focus on agribusiness and the industrial agriculture as a mode of production versus local.
So that relates to the sort of thing that goes on in New Zealand. All of the sheep and the cattle are grass-fed in open fields, not in great big lots with corn, as an example.
Next question.
We're all here because of human impacts on our globe and the climate. My question is, what is the long-term sustainable population of humans that we can have on this globe? And are we already exceeding that?
we are if we all have the American lifestyle and the footprint on the planet. But if we downgrade or become much more sustainable, then maybe we can sustain something closer to what we have today. But in many respects, we're overpopulated, and the governments of China and India, one of their primary goals is to elevate the standards of living of their people, and you can't complain about them trying to have a goal of bringing electricity and a refrigerator to people in those countries. But as they do that, their footprints increase on the planet, and if they are aspiring to have the same footprint as an American, then where the planet is already way overpopulated, in my view, and it will have consequences. And some of those consequences have been talked about. Some of them relate to growing numbers of conflicts of various kinds and environmental refugees.
Other responses there?
Come on, somebody should respond to that.
I mean, I talk about it, I teach about it in my class, and there's the number of how many people we have. There's multiple different numbers for how many people could coexist on the planet and not bring the planet down, and that's definitely related to consumption. I think the number is we're never going to know the exact number because there's so much creativity and invention that can happen as part of it. So I think this gets back to some of what Dick Grossman raised, which is where and how do we think about and manage for population on our planet. And it's really, and I did have the plan, Dick, that I would say this at some point to make sure I said it. There you are. I see you back there. That if you look at Paul Hawkins' list from Drawdown, the number one single way to manage for climate warming is to plan better for refrigerants, and that's a very unglamorous thing to have to talk about, and he mentions that in his talks. But if you add together number 6 and number 7, which is educate women and girls and family planning, that becomes the number one way to plan for climate change on our planet. And it's where and how you empower women so that they feel that they can choose and have a choice and not, so that there's more ability to choose. I don't know, I feel that I end up in dangerous territory trying to find the right words to say things politely. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Next question.
Dr. Trenberth, I'd like to bring it back to Hurricane Harvey. Can you explain what the brown ocean effect is and how it impacts landfall hurricanes such as Harvey?
What is?
The brown ocean effect. About the land surface areas getting so saturated with hot water that when the hurricane comes over the land, it starts sucking up the heat and moisture.
Yes, but I mean, in the case of Harvey, it was very important that it was large and it could reach out to the Gulf. Certainly, having water over land helps a little bit. I mean, what was surprising with Harvey was that it actually developed to be a Category 4 storm in the location that it was, because about 1/3 of the area around Harvey, the air was coming from over land where it is much drier and it doesn't provide the moisture that gets into the precipitation that fuels the storm. So that was quite unusual already at that stage, but the key certainly was the moisture from over the Gulf and the high ocean heat content that kept sustaining relatively high sea surface temperatures. Having a big dumping of water over land didn't hurt, but I don't know just how much it helped either. That's the sort of thing that we can sort out a bit more with experiments with models at some later point.
The question is, the brown ocean effect is something that's being talked about more and more. Could you explain it?
I'm not sure exactly what, I mean, the
I could say
the Earth, you know, the fuel for a hurricane is the moisture in the atmosphere that condenses the heat that went into the evaporation of moisture in the first place. When that condenses, comes back into the atmosphere as latent heat. That's the fuel for a hurricane. And so moisture flowing into the storm is vital. In the case of a hurricane, the average hurricane is 250 kilometers in radius, 250 miles in radius, and the moisture flows is from 1,000 miles away. It actually spirals in. And one of the reasons you can actually see a hurricane from satellites is because there's relatively clear air all around the hurricane, because that clear air is actually a part of the circulation. It's part of the air that has flowed out of the hurricane at the upper levels and is subsiding in the area around and is then gradually spiraling back into the hurricane. So that's picking up moisture as it comes in. If it's over land, then it's not picking up moisture, and hurricanes tend to fade or die out over land, in part because of that effect and in part because of the extra roughness of land. So that's presumably the brown ocean effect, that if you've dumped a whole lot of water on the land, there is a capability for some moisture to re-evaporate back into the atmosphere and to help refuel the storm, if you like.
next question. This is Laurie Dixon, who's the executive director of Four Core, one of our local nonprofits. Four Core is the Four Corners Office for Resource Efficiency.
Hi, thank you all for coming today. Kind of a different, almost non-scientific tangent here, but I even heard it today. They were great presentations, but the common use of the word belief, I believe in climate change, believe, and that narrative is, I think, very destructive to the argument. And I see it, and we have to sort of rely on the experts to be the spokespersons for climate change and the facts and the data that exists around it, rather than do you believe or accept climate change. So that's a piece that I just wanted some reflection on, because I'm seeing it every day, especially in the media. And if you're the one speaking to the media, how can we change that narrative? So.
It's not a matter of belief, of course, because there are a tremendous number of facts. There's a tremendous amount of evidence. And this is what is the core of science, of course. You know, and I tried to present, and also the physical arguments about how all of these things hang together. And so it's not a matter of belief in this.
Go ahead.
I would just say thanks for the heads up. When we all are trying to present data, and as scientists, that makes us believe things. Some folks don't operate that way, but your cautionary point is really good. We should be careful when we say we believe. We say the evidence demands. Good idea.
I'm sorry, Root. We have to keep the Root. Please, we have to keep the order here.
Let's see. So the way that I talk about it with students in my classes is to say that the physical and chemical understanding that was shared by Kevin is very clear and very evident, and it's not new. It's knowledge we've had about the way our planet works, using very simple understanding, very simple technology of the planet. We don't need all of what we can do today. I think the hard part is, and this comes from the perspective of a biologist, is in figuring out just what the impacts are and where and how we care about the floods, the tornadoes, the whatever the changes are on the planet. And that's not to say that that's different from belief. It's not using the word belief, but it's really hard to gather the data on where and how species agriculture systems are being changed and affected. And in part, that's what Emile did a really great job highlighting. There are these ways that there are some species that will benefit at the same time there are other species that don't benefit. And so how can we have that full range of discussions? And then, as she so clearly and well did, that the preponderance of the evidence is that it will have negative consequences for more people and more species.
I just want to add one thing. I mean, we talk about skeptics and deniers, and all scientists are skeptical and demand the evidence and to understand how that hangs together, and that's not unreasonable. But when we talk about deniers, we're actually talking about people who are denying fundamental facts and evidence, and that's happening all too often in the realm of climate change.
I would just add, I think part of this is it's a language issue. I think as culture we have created a science cohort that is separate from a lot of people because we don't value education. We don't invest in teachers and as parents we haven't told our students that the language of science, the scientific method, the fact that there's a difference between skepticism and wanting to understand more. And so we scientists have created a vocabulary and a language that doesn't always meet the public at their level of understanding. And I think, we own that problem as a state of Colorado when we're 49th in education spending. Again, I'm on a soapbox here, but we have, as scientists and citizens, we have to come together and strive to understand each other a little bit better. And I think part of it is we haven't figured out how to best communicate effectively many of the things that we take as truth.
Next, the microphone is back in the right.
We came from the Cortez High School, and as young people, I'm just curious as to what we can do to be more involved with the global climate movements and anything.
Is Susan over there? Got the wrong name.
Susan.
Yeah. Meet Susan. And then come here to college.
And I'll add, share your voice. Work and engage with people who want to help you learn how to share your voice. I was at Mountain Film this summer in Telluride for Memorial Day weekend, and my two kids are over there, and one just turned 8, and my 8-year-old went up to a big fluffy white dog that was owned by the filmmaker for Chasing Coral, and he proceeded to explain to her where and how the albedo effect worked, including explaining and using the word albedo. And she just looked at me and she's like, "What do you do?" And I was like, children are capable of far more than we realize. I asked my babysitter to bring my kids because I want them to see and be part of this, see me, have their own voice, and they can start sharing their voice at 10. One of the films I saw one of the people I met at the film festival was a 11-year-old girl who's suing the federal government because she's concerned about the impacts of climate change, and she was one of the rock stars of the whole festival. So yeah, work with me. I would love to see and interact with you and work with others, Susan, and let's make sure all the voices across generations are heard.
I would add to that, there are a lot of things that you can do now. One would be making your own observations. Start by looking at the world around you, whatever motivates you, whatever you're really interested in, and start measuring it. Become part of the National Phenology Network or many of the other networks that are available. You can do that now. How great would it be to have that data record by the time you're 80, making measurements? So I would say just get involved in whatever you're very interested in.
Okay. There you are. Okay.
My name is Werner Heiber. First, I'd like to make a plug for Think Globally, Act Locally. We do have 4 core that is running on a shoestring budget, but it's doing outstanding work, the Four Corners Office of Resource Efficiency. We also have SASCO locally, the Sustainability Alliance. We have Jim Dyer, the local food network. We have Local First. So there's a lot of local groups that need your support and where you can get engaged. The question to the panel is, we heard a lot of science. But to me, the elephant, or one of the big elephants in the room, is a short-term profit economy and businesses, where everything, and we are part of that, where everything is measured on short-term profits versus on long-term profits, and is there a possibility to have a steady state economy to take hold in the future?
Isn't that Schumacher's idea in 1970? It was a really good one.
That's right.
Was it called Small is Beautiful? That was his book,
The first
right?
is to address the short-term profit economy concept and what our economy is based on.
I mean, I think you're correct with regard to the private sector. They respond to the environment that they're in, but this is where there can be a key role for government. And so this is where something like a carbon tax, a price on carbon, can make an enormous difference. I think the private sector would do enormously well. And in fact, I've testified on Capitol Hill right next to utility people and so on. And they don't so much fear having a carbon tax. They just want to know what it is so that they can plan for it properly and they can build it into their ways of doing business. And so this is where the role of government, in my view, actually becomes very important. They set the stage that all of these other developments and incentives occur in.
So I think that's a hard question for many of us to answer because we were brought to the panel with expertise on natural science and the natural science system. So Gary, Steve, you guys have your topic for the next panel. Bring in the business and the social scientists, lifelong learning can start to coordinate that. We have those experts at Fort Lewis College too, we just don't happen to be them.
I would make the observation that there exists an organization called the Center for the Advancement of a Steady State Economy that a subset of ecological economists who are studying this issue and saying, how do you get from here to there? It's not simple, and I will leave it at that. Where is the microphone moved? Way in the back.
This question is concerning an issue which I had heard previously about with permafrost melting and sequestration of carbon being released. So Gary, your slide on predictions for atmospheric CO2 rising higher than the models predicted, I thought maybe you could answer that and see if that's still a big concern or if it was just a canary in the coal mine.
I'm trying to remember the slide, and then I bet you. Anyway, remind me of what else was on that slide, Tim? Oh, I'm sorry. That slide was actually showing sea level rise, and in that particular graph, the modeled sea level based on past wasn't quite as steep as the curve of sea level rise that we're observing. So, so that one was about sea level, and questions about permafrost, I'm going to pass to either Heidi or Kevin because they've both worked on modeling that, or at least she's worked on it. And yeah, anyway.
So there is concern that there'll be additional carbon dioxide coming out of thawing permafrost soils. But more than that, there's concern about methane coming out of those soils. And it's a more potent greenhouse gas. And since I like to tell stories, I have to tell a story. I went up to the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta this summer as part of a NSF-funded project. And I stood on the edge of a Arctic pond lake that you could see burps coming up there were bubbles coming up. That was somewhat remarkable all by itself, but what was more remarkable was working with a 22-year-old student who recently graduated from St. Olaf College, who is passionate and excited about understanding how greenhouse gases are merged through water, and where and how when they come up through a lake or water-laden soils, it's a little bit different. And she knew far more than I did about the question that you're asking. And we stood on the edge of this lake, and I have video footage of this, and she started jumping up and down. And she just stood there and started jumping, and she just kind of like moved along the edge of the lake, jumping, jumping, jumping. And it was just unbelievable how much gas she could push out of the ground in the soil. And if she wasn't there jumping, all that gas would still be coming out. It would just take a little bit more, but sort of that, I was like, how did you know? And she just had been paying really careful attention to each step she'd been taking as we were sampling the edge of the lake. And so she'd seen and observed something that I hadn't yet observed. And so that gets back to the youth question too. It's really incredible what you can accomplish as part of an undergraduate education, and you can go into a tundra landscape and explore and discover things that the experts aren't seeing, which is really cool.
Let me make a few comments. I mean, this relates indeed to the carbon in the soils. The permafrost, by the way, the term permafrost people use is thawing. Permafrost doesn't melt, but nevertheless. But it is increasingly thawing, and so that gives rise to the availability of soil carbon and bogs that are active in one form or the other. And the key question is the role of water. Water does play currently a very large role, and so the nature of the decay of that carbon in the soils depends very much on whether it's aerobic or anaerobic, whether there's water or not. And so this relates to what happens if you have a compost heap. Some of you may have a compost heap, and a very healthy compost heap decays, gets very warm inside, and it decays, and it will produce carbon dioxide at quite a rapid rate. But if it gets too wet, then a different kind of bacteria tend to take over. It's an anaerobic form of decay, and it will generate methane. And so you can either get methane or carbon dioxide depending on how dry things are and whether bogs actually dry out or not. And so this is an important issue because there is a lot of soil carbon which can get into the atmosphere, firstly in the form of methane. And methane also ultimately gets oxidized. It gets and ends up as carbon dioxide. Methane typically has a lifetime of a decade or something like that, but it adds to the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So this is a feedback that can amplify the climate change.
Let's see. Next question. Okay.
Oh, hello. My name is Carrie. I'm a student here at Fort Lewis, but I was wondering, from my observations and from my perspective as a young person, climate change has been pretty well integrated into our lives. I mean, I watched An Inconvenient Truth when I was in 5th grade, and that's never been a doubt in my mind that I was going to have to change my lifestyle to accommodate climate change, and I think that goes with most of the other students here that I know. We've changed how we transport ourselves. Most of us ride bicycles around town to get our groceries. We've changed how we consume. We've changed from buying new clothes to buying used clothes. We've changed our diets. We've changed our entire lifestyle, and I was just wondering how you guys have been out there, you've been doing the research, and you've been interacting with a lot of different people. How would you suggest that we continue to be radical and continue to be involved while still being connected to the rest of our community? I know I run into a lot of issues with people my parents' age or my grandparents' age, trying to bring up with them, like, I don't want to have children because I feel like my carbon footprint would be too great doing that, and how I should stay connected to someone who has a 3,000 square foot house that I'm supposed to go back to at Christmas. You know, like, I was just wondering how you would suggest that we still stay radical and stick to our beliefs and keep making change, but still also remain connected to society.
Great question.
Have have honest, open, compassionate discussions with those people that you know who are living what you think are an overconsumptive lifestyle. Cutting people off who have different values than you do will stop the conversation, and that's the last thing we need to do. So I'm out there on my bike with you, and so like you can lead in many ways, and it sounds like you're leading in many ways. Just continue communicating in many ways.
Other responses to that question?
I mean, there's a lot of things you can do as an individual, and I have solar panels on the roof of my house, and I have a lot of extra insulation in the house, and efficient light bulbs, and drive a small, fuel efficient car, or take the bus. I took the bus to the airport in order to get here today, and you can live your life that way and try to promote, a smaller footprint. I don't think you should stop doing things just because everybody else isn't doing it. And this is like cutting off your nose to spite your face or something. But so it's one thing to work to promote more sustainable practices in your lifestyle. But keep going by all means. And in particular, one of the most important things you can do is to be involved and vote.
So I think part of your question, which was so fantastic and incredible, thank you, is how do you have and begin to engage with some of the people that you feel less connected to? Because that's part of your question too, I think. I'm trying to figure out how to do that too. I'm trying lots of different approaches because I'm not sure I'll hit on it the first time that I try it. And one of the things I have to keep reminding myself, there's this voice in the back of my head all the time these days that just says, listen, just ask questions and listen thoughtfully to the answers, and then ask a next question, rather than start to interject the ideas, the understanding, the opinion, wanting to tell people how to live. I can't, it's part of what has happened as being a professor at Fort Lewis. I can't make people want to learn. I have to create a space in which they want to learn and then encourage them. And I think the same is true for where and how we encourage people to make some of these choices by listening and asking more questions.
I would add a footnote to that. What you described can be a lonely road. Find fellow travelers, but don't just include your own group. But you still always have to be open to the outside. It is 5 o'clock, or just about 5 o'clock. I believe the happy hour is prepared to begin, but I know there are still unanswered questions or unasked questions. So if you feel a need to get home or to get early into the refreshment stand, please do so quietly, and we'll take a couple more questions.
A quick announcement.
Hi, my name's Emile. I'm from the Zero Waste team at the Environmental Center. Just a reminder to recycle your cans and plastic cups. There's a bin right by the door and over there. Thank you.
I'm going to use my power as the holder of the microphone to ask only young people to have comments or questions. We old people have made a mess of the world, and I think it's up to young people to express their views.
Thank you. I would just like to say from the previous speaker that I think my generation is very aware and conscious of climate change, and I'm just wondering about the balance between what we give up and how we still live our own lives. So if you can speak about that. Because you're talking about like being kind and stuff, but that's not really like measurable things. And I'm just wondering, like, I don't think that's quite enough for, to really impact. It feels like to really impact and preserve our planet.
So one of the things that's come up in amazing discussions with students in my introductory environmental science class for non-science majors is how challenging it is for them to make the choices you all are describing to live sustainably, given the crunch on their time, and that it takes time to do all the things that are part of being more sustainable. So part of that means that we need to change so much about the work world and the balance of work time. I mean, 60-hour weeks, you can't do that and live sustainably that easily, because there are all these other activities. Either that, or you have to have and earn enough money to have somebody else who does all that work for you, and isn't it more rewarding? So no, there's a lot that needs to change. The kindness comes from, and I think we can change those things. That's the other thing. The kindness comes from just how often people feel isolated, alone, disconnected, unable to share their ideas with one another. And I've heard Dick and several other people say compassion. So kindness, compassion, that willingness to listen, to be present in each other's worlds. And I think a lot of things, we don't move forward with more change because we're stuck at that place and at that point. And so at the same time that it seems overly simplistic, I can think of so many ways each day in my life would be better if I was more kind to others, and and that there was that exchange and reciprocity back and forth. And so that's where and then you'd feel great and you wouldn't need to turn on the TV. I don't know, kind of those things.
I agree with Heidi. I'm not going to argue against kindness at all. Agree we need more of that, certainly, in our world. We also need some more social action and some more marches, some more political people running for office that are willing to stand up, some more voting by the young people in our country. So there are other things. And that's a kind thing too. If you vote, I think we'd all feel that. So there are a lot of other social things you can do as well.
How many people in the audience have solar panels? It's quite a lot. There's another way in which you can utilize solar power, and that is when you do a laundry, hang it on the clothesline. How many people hang it on the clothesline? Why don't you do that? You might be surprised. You'll actually save a lot of money, and you'll have a much smaller carbon footprint.
Any other responses here? Dr. Rotman has suggested that the panelists have been very generous with their time. Dr. Grossman is pointing to one more student, whom I'll accept that one last question.
Sweet. So with the introduction of CRISPR, do you think that, and its ability to cure specific diseases, do you think that it'll have an effect on population, or how its effect on population will do to our climate?
I believe the question, could you repeat the question? Because it was something about CRISPR and population, but I wasn't sure about the connection you were making.
Like how it can cure specific diseases, and that will cause an increase in population spike, and how that can affect climate and deforestation and such things like that.
Okay, I think the question then is how does the CRISPR technology, and for the audience that is this new gene editing technology where you very sharply targeted and beginning to see potential use in humans to correct genetic defects and so on. Heidi could probably describe that more accurately. But the question is, does that have an implication for actually increasing population growth and exacerbating climate change?
So I'll give you the geologist's long-term perspective on that, and that is that decreasing human suffering through medicine is a good thing. Not necessarily. I'm not endorsing genetic engineering entirely, but only when that is coupled with what Dick Grossman has been telling us all afternoon, and that is very aggressive family planning, so that we have the babies we want to have in this world, and that people have the access to birth control, so that they have children when they want to. So maybe it's a double-edged sword. You can improve the quality of life for both people who are alive, people who are going to be alive, by using medicine and smart planning.
Heidi? Oh, okay. Anyone else? Okay. With that, I will apologize to the people whose questions did not get asked. However, the panelists will be sticking around, and hopefully you have a chance to catch them as part of the refreshments. And I want to thank all of the panelists for their presentations and their responses. Thank everyone who's come today to make this a step towards addressing climate change in our own community and in the larger world.